Have you ever wished you were a powerful ancient ruler? Because tonight, you might change your mind. This is a quiet journey through the golden age of Egypt, but not the story you have heard before. Not of glory, but of burden, of isolation, and of a crown that came at a heavy price. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and let the soft stillness of the desert night surround you. By the way, what time are you watching this right now? Is it midnight, 2, 3 a.m., or are you just winding down from your day? Leave a comment below. I always love seeing what time people drift into this forgotten world. Now let the story begin, and may it carry you gently toward sleep. Becoming a pharaoh was not just a rise to power. It was the beginning of a life ruled by isolation, pressure, and the crushing weight of divine expectation. From the very first day, a child was declared heir to the throne. They were removed from the world of other children and placed into a carefully controlled environment where every word, every gesture, every lesson was dictated by priests, scholars, and advisors who believed they were shaping a living God. Imagine growing up, never being allowed to run freely through a market, never climbing a tree or playing without supervision because your feet were considered too sacred to touch common soil. Education was not a matter of curiosity or joy. It was duty. Day after day, the young pharaoh-to-be was fed endless lines of ancient texts, divine laws, military strategy, and ritual procedures. All of it drilled into their mind with no room for error. A single misstep could mean offending the gods, risking famine, or sparking rebellion. Their meals were chosen for them. Their tutors watched their every movement, and servants were assigned not to care for them as children, but to maintain the perfection of the divine image they were expected to become. Even in early youth, the pressure was immense, for it was believed that the balance of Mat, the sacred order of the universe, depended entirely on the pharaoh's ability to lead, to command, and to remain flawless in all things. That weight was not symbolic. It was real. It was daily. It was exhausting. A boy or girl who became a god on earth was never allowed to be human again. And though temples rose in their name and songs praised their greatness, not a single friend could truly know them, for none were their equal. The pharaoh's appearance was curated like a statue. From ornate headdresses to heavy gold jewelry, from stiff ceremonial poses to hours spent in ritual grooming. Everything they wore and everything they did had a specific purpose in maintaining their godlike status. They could not show fear, could not show grief, could not be seen sick or even overly tired. If they wept, it was in private. If they felt lost, there was no one they could turn to. There was only the expectation of perfection and the knowledge that a kingdom of thousands looked to them not just for leadership, but for divine signs of prosperity. Many pharaohs died young, not only from assassination or disease, but from the sheer strain of their position. Every day brought political manipulation from court officials, threats of rebellion in distant provinces, diplomatic games with foreign kingdoms, and the endless rituals demanded by the priesthood. There were no days off, no time for peace. Even in the tombs of their ancestors, pharaohs saw not rest, but warning, for failure to uphold the sacred duties meant eternal punishment, not just for them, but for their people. The loneliness of the role became unbearable for many. They were surrounded by hundreds of servants, wives, scribes, and guards, yet truly knew none of them. Everyone wore a mask of reverence. Every smile was either fear, ambition, or manipulation. Even their own children were raised by appointed caretakers until they were old enough to be molded into heirs, not sons or daughters. A pharaoh could not trust freely. Every moment had to be calculated, every emotion controlled. It was not leadership, it was performance. Some pharaohs turned to monumental building projects, not out of pride, but desperation. It's a way to leave behind something permanent in a world where their own lives were utterly disposable. To carve their name in stone, to be remembered, to not disappear into the dust like countless forgotten rulers before them. That was often the only comfort they had. But even that came at a cost. The lives of thousands of workers, years of planning, the constant fear that it would all be undone by the next ruler or the next generation. When the sun set each evening and the palace walls grew quiet, the Pharaoh was left alone in chambers too grand to feel like home. The silence echoed off gold and stone, the weight of divine responsibility pressing against their chest like the granite blocks used to seal their future tomb. Sleep did not come easily. Visions of unrest, of plague, of betrayal haunted even the most powerful rulers. Dreams of walking freely through the world, unnoticed, unburdened, were as unreachable as the stars. And so began the daily cycle, ruling from a throne of stone, bowed under the illusion of godhood, watching the world move around them as they remained perfectly still. For the Pharaoh power was a prison, a sacred, golden, eternal prison, and there was no escape. To the people of Egypt, the Pharaoh was not simply a ruler. He was a god made flesh, the physical bridge between the heavens and the earth. But beneath the layers of gold, behind the carefully crafted mask, lived a person trapped in a life of endless performance. There was no room for fatigue, no place for hesitation, and certainly no tolerance for doubt. Every sunrise brought not just a new day, but a new set of appearances to uphold, ceremonies to lead, decisions to finalize, all while projecting an image of unwavering control and divine certainty. The performance began before the public ever saw him. Servants would rise before the first light of dawn to prepare the sacred garments, to anoint the skin with perfumed oils, to ensure that every fold in the linen, every shimmer of gold, looked untouched by mortal hands. The headdress was placed not simply as fashion, but as a symbol, a message to the world that the gods still walked among them. The Pharaoh's very breath was seen as holy, and yet behind every breath was a man who had not chosen this path, but inherited it. Rituals consumed every hour. In the morning, he would greet the sun god Ra with recitations and offerings, standing stiff in the temple's sacred courtyard, as priests chanted in low hypnotic rhythms. In the afternoon, he would attend councils, settle disputes between nobles, approve construction plans, oversee grain allocations. All of it required intense focus and precision, because any mistake could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness could lead to revolt, famine, or assassination. By evening, he was back in the temple, giving thanks, performing purification rites, and offering more gifts to the gods, as if bargaining for another day of stability. But the truth that no one spoke aloud was this: the Pharaoh's power depended entirely on perception. Behind palace walls, corrupt officials schemed for influence. High priests quietly wielded more control than any advisor dared to admit. And foreign enemies watched for any sign that the throne was losing its grip. One slip of the mask, one rumor of illness or fear, and the entire empire could begin to tremble. So the performance never ended. Not for a moment, not even in private. There were spies among the servants, hidden alliances within the royal court, whispers carried by guards from one wing of the palace to the next. The Pharaoh had to smile at those who hated him, trust those who plotted against him, and reward those who only stood beside him to advance themselves. His meals had to be tested for poison, his steps measured to avoid hidden traps. He could not sleep without at least 2 guards posted near his door, not for protection alone, but to ensure no one got close enough to silence him forever. Even his family was part of the spectacle. Royal wives were chosen not for love, but for lineage, political alliances, or the need to produce an heir. Children were celebrated as divine gifts, but were swiftly handed over to tutors, molded into future pieces of the state machine. The Pharaoh was expected to be a loving father, but not too soft. A devoted husband, but not too distracted. His emotions, like everything else, were tools to be used when necessary, and hidden when not. To question the gods, even in private, was unthinkable. If disaster struck, it was not nature or fate. It was a sign that the Pharaoh had failed in his sacred duties. If the Nile did not flood, if locusts swarmed the crops, if plague moved through the cities, blame fell not on the winds or stars, but on the throne. And though the priests whispered their rituals and the people sang their praises, the Pharaoh knew deep down that their loyalty lasted only as long as the blessings did. So he smiled. He spoke in controlled tones. He gave gifts to nobles and land to temples. He walked through crowds of worshippers, pretending not to hear the murmurs of discontent beneath the chants. And when he stood at the top of his palace, looking out over the kingdom he ruled, he did not feel pride. He felt distance, kind of distance that grows between a man and the world when every moment of his life is a performance. There were times when the Pharaoh might stare at a flickering lamp or trace the edge of a clay tablet and wonder what his life might have been if he had not worn the crown. What it would feel like to laugh without consequence, to fall in love without calculation, to age without fear. But those thoughts were fleeting. He had learned to silence them, because the role allowed no room for dreams. At night, when the court was asleep and the halls fell silent, the Pharaoh would lie still beneath fine linens, and though his body rested, his mind remained alert, rehearsing lines for tomorrow's audience, recalling faces that needed favor, replaying decisions that could cost lives. This was not the life of a free man. It was the life of a sacred puppet, suspended by strings of tradition, power, and fear. And so, each day he rose again, dressed the part, spoke the words, and stepped back onto the stage of empire. For to stop was to fall, and to fall was not allowed. To the outside world, the Pharaoh's connection to the gods seemed like a gift, a sacred privilege passed down from the heavens. But for the one wearing the crown, it was a burden carved deeper than stone. From birth, the Pharaoh was taught not only that he was a ruler, but that he was Horus in the flesh, the falcon god of kingship, the son of Ra, the keeper of Med, the one who must maintain the balance of all things. That belief was not metaphorical. It was literal. People believed their crops, their health, their safety, all depended on whether the Pharaoh pleased the gods each day. And so the pressure was not political alone. It was cosmic. He could not ignore the gods. Every moment, every ritual, every gesture was watched, judged, recorded by priests who themselves wielded power second only to the throne. The Pharaoh could not enter a room without being purified. He could not speak before certain gods without wearing the correct amulet. His schedule was dictated by planetary alignments, lunar cycles, and the needs of dozens of temples spread across the land. Even his breath had to be regulated during some rituals. Shallow, controlled, sacred. Some pharaohs believed in the gods deeply and feared their wrath with every fiber of their soul. Others began to doubt, but could never speak it aloud, because to question the gods was to question the throne itself, and doing so could unravel the empire. If a divine sign was missed or misinterpreted, if a ritual was rushed or skipped, it was believed the Pharaoh had offended the heavens, and the consequences were swift. A bad flood season could mean starvation. A solar eclipse could cause panic. A sudden illness could spark rumors that the gods were displeased, and those whispers spread faster than fire through dry reed. The rituals were endless. Sacrifices to Osiris at dawn, offerings to Isis before meals, libations to Thoth during full moons, public festivals where the Pharaoh was carried on a golden bark, waving to thousands, hiding exhaustion behind a frozen smile. Then came the personal rituals, the ones behind palace walls, where blood might be spilled, where chants went on for hours, where incense burned thick enough to choke. These were not theatrical acts, they were obligations. If one ritual failed, the harvest might rot. If a god was angered, a plague might follow. Stakes were spiritual and terrifying. And yet, the Pharaoh was not in control of the rituals. The high priests held that power. They alone read the omens, keyed when a god needed more, keyed. We alone could decide if the Pharaoh had done enough. In theory, the Pharaoh ruled the land. In practice, he often bowed to the temple. The priest whispered that Ra required more gold. The treasury opened. The dream interpreter said Sekhmet demanded war. The armies marched. Even the Pharaoh's dreams were not private. Cicadas to be decoded, examined, weighed for hidden meanings. This divine duty seeped into every aspect of life. When the Pharaoh fell ill, he did not just see a healer. He saw a priest. When his wife gave birth, the priests oversaw the process. When a royal pet died, it too had to be mummified, blessed, and buried with ceremony. Nothing could be simple. Nothing could be human. Gods watched all. And when tragedy struck, as it always did, the gods were never blamed directly. The fault always came back to the Pharaoh. If his son died young, had he not honored Anubis properly? If a drought struck the south, had he failed to light this sacred flame on the solstice? If foreign enemies breached the border, had he fallen from the favor of Ammon? These were the questions the people whispered, and the priests repeated with softer words but sharper intent. And so the guilt grew, heavy as granite, until it shaped his very thoughts. The worst fear was not death, but judgment. For in death, the Pharaoh would stand before Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths. His heart weighed against a feather, his soul exposed for all sins and failures. This was not a tale for the common people alone. The Pharaoh believed it too, that even after a life of suffering, of ritual, of sacrifice, one moment of weakness might damn him to eternal hunger, eternal darkness, eternal erasure. And so he planned his tomb with obsessive care, hired architects, consulted astrologers, hoarded treasures, wrote spells, all in hope that he might pass the final test. But deep inside, even the most devout Pharaoh must have wondered, was it all enough? Had he been pure enough, strong enough, holy enough? And if not, would he be forgotten, devoured, cast out from the eternal field of reeds, or a god on earth? Doubt was the most dangerous curse of all. So he prayed harder, performed longer, built temples wider and taller, hoping the gods would see, hoping they would forgive, hoping they were even listening. And when he looked at the stars, he did not see comfort. He saw judgment, cold, vast, eternal. The gods gave him power, but they gave him no peace, only duty, only fear, only silence. To rule Egypt was to sleep with one eye open, for even though the Pharaoh was worshipped like a god, he was never truly safe. Power in the ancient world did not flow like a steady river. It surged and crashed like the Nile, carrying hidden dangers beneath its surface. And the Pharaoh stood in the center of it all, surrounded by gold and adoration, yet haunted constantly by whispers in the shadows. Paranoia was not a weakness, it was survival. Assassination was a silent threat that never left the room, no matter how loyal his guards seemed, no matter how polished the courtiers looked. Every step had to be measured. Servants who prepared his food were watched closely. Cupbearers were chosen from trusted families, their hands inspected before every meal. Even the cushions he sat on were examined by priests for hidden curses, because betrayal could come in 1,000 forms, and often it came dressed in silk with a smile. Courtiers bowed low, but their eyes flicked sideways, calculating, waiting for weakness. A sick Pharaoh invited ambition. A hesitant Pharaoh encouraged rebellion. Vicious generals returned from victories with songs and cheers, but sometimes they dreamed of taking the throne for themselves. High priests murmured in their temples, gathering influence, controlling access to the gods. Royal siblings, half-brothers, even wives, were not immune to ambition either. The more trusted someone was, the more dangerous they could become. Poison was the weapon of choice for cowards. and it was feared more than any sword. A sip of bad wine, a bite of spiced bread, a ceremonial perfume that burned too long in the nostrils. The palace had layers of taste testers, yet fear lingered like smoke. The pharaoh often ate alone, not from pride, but for safety. His chamber walls were thick, but not thick enough to silence every sound. Footsteps in the hall at midnight, a whispered name, a servant taking too long to return. Every moment fed the growing fire of suspicion. And then there were the dreams. Not sent by gods, but by memory. Dreams of betrayal, of thrones overthrown, of statues crumbled, and names scratched from walls. The pharaoh knew the stories of rulers erased from history, their faces chiseled out, their tombs ransacked, their souls condemned to wander forgot. It had happened before, and it could happen again. For all their divine titles, pharaohs were not immortal. They were as fragile as the people who feared them, and often just as disposable. The only way to survive was control. Control the court, control the priests, control the army, control the story. That meant issuing decrees quickly before the nobles could organize. That meant marrying daughters of generals, turning rivals into family. That meant placing spies in temples, bribing scribes, and silencing those who asked too many questions. The palace became a maze of secrets. Trust became a luxury no one could afford. Some pharaohs resorted to brutal purges. A rumor would reach their ears, and within a day, whole households would vanish. Servants removed, officials stripped of titles, suspects dragged to prison, never seen again. Fear was a tool, sharp and bloody, and it kept the wheels of power turning. But each act of control created new enemies. Blood brought silence, but silence carried resentment. The fear that protected the pharaoh also isolated him further, until the only people left were those too afraid to speak truth at all. Even joy was dangerous. To celebrate too openly, to laugh too long, was to lower one's guard. A pharaoh who looked too content was seen as weak. A ruler who showed mercy was seen as soft. And so emotions were buried deep, hidden behind layers of ceremony and stone. The heart became a locked vault, its contents known only to the gods, or perhaps not even to them. Festivals and public appearances were choreographed like theater. The people cheered, the drums beat, flowers were tossed into the street, and the pharaoh smiled, waved, blessed, and moved through the crowd like a statue brought to life. But behind that smile was calculation. Where are the guards? Who is standing too close? Why is that noble staring too long? Even joy was a risk. In the quietest hours of night, when even the jackals had gone silent, the pharaoh would sit by a flickering lamp, reading messages carved in clay, names of governors, border skirmishes, changes in temple, donations, and he would wonder who among them dreams of the throne, who sees themselves in the crown, who would smile at his funeral. And yet he continued, because to stop was death, to rest was to fall behind, to trust was to invite ruin. And so the pharaoh rose each day, put on his golden mask, and stepped into the light with steady feet, all while the shadows behind him grew deeper. He ruled by fear, ruled through ritual, ruled because the alternative was chaos, and chaos would consume him first. It was a lonely kingdom, not of sand, but of silence. A silence filled with the weight of unseen eyes, and the eternal question, who can I trust? To the people in the streets, the palace was a symbol of unmatched power. Tall walls, polished courtyards, servants in endless procession, and banners that fluttered like gods were always watching, lit for the pharaoh inside. It was a prison carved from limestone in silence. The architecture was perfect, the pillars grand, the pools reflected the sky, and yet It was a place where freedom ended the moment the crown was placed on his head. For all its beauty, it was never home. It was a gilded cage. The layout of the palace was not designed for comfort. It was built for control. Every doorway, every corridor, every threshold was created with security in mind. There were no secret places to hide, no private corners to think. Guards stood at every entrance. Servants whispered through every hallway, and priests wandered through chambers with incense and scrolls, reminding the ruler of his obligations. Solitude was rare, and when it did arrive, it came not as relief, but as a reminder of just how alone he was. Rooms were filled with luxury, golden furniture, silk cushions, perfumes from Nubia, lapis lazuli from the east. But they were not chosen by the pharaoh. They were placed there by caretakers, decorators, overseers who had memorized ancient guidelines on how a god-king should live. Even the beds were symbolic, carved with images of the sun's daily journey, surrounded by protective carvings of cobras and falcons. The very walls whispered expectation. There was no softness in them, only tradition. To leave the palace required days of planning. Escorts had to be prepared, offerings arranged, streets cleared, soldiers deployed. A simple walk beyond the gates meant full ceremony, so the pharaoh often remained inside, watching the world through narrow windows or from rooftops lined with stone lions. Outside, farmers tilled soil. Children played with sticks in the dust. Merchants laughed in shaded stalls. Inside, everything was controlled, hushed, rehearsed. The royal harem was kept in another wing, not for intimacy or joy, but for politics. Wives from noble families were given not as gifts of love, but as guarantees of loyalty. Each one represented a region, a tribe, a power base. The pharaoh might visit, speak kindly, father children, but it was duty, not affection. Love had no place in the palace, only lineage, only legacy. And if a queen grew too influential, or bore a child too ambitious, she could become a threat. The same walls that echoed with laughter one day could hold silent judgment the next. Even within the court, there was no equality. Servants bowed too deeply. Nobles smiled too long. Guards stood too still. Every gesture was performed, every word chosen with care. Conversations never flowed naturally. There was no banter, no warm familiarity, only reports, requests, and the careful navigation of royal mood. And the pharaoh learned early that any sign of frustration would be remembered, repeated, and used. He could not cry, not in front of anyone. If he did, it meant weakness. If he showed pain, it meant the gods were losing their strength. And so, even when grief came, when a child died, when a trusted advisor was buried, the pharaoh mourned behind closed doors. Even then, the walls seemed to watch. Even then, silence demanded control. Some pharaohs wrote poems, private inscriptions hidden on papyrus scrolls, left behind in secret compartments, hoping to express something real before death came. Most of those writings were never meant to be read. They were confessions, questions, prayers whispered without answers. Words like, "Do they see me?" or "Will I ever be more than a symbol?" But these writings were dangerous. Discovered, they could be interpreted as heresy, weakness, or madness. So even the truth had to be buried. The palace garden, a place designed for calm, became a place for pacing. The cool pools held lotus flowers. The air was sweet with myrrh, but the pharaoh did not relax there. He walked the paths with advisors at his side, discussing grain taxes, border tensions, temple politics. Even the birds in the trees seemed to listen. The water reflected not his face, but the burden he carried. Even here, within the most beautiful part of the palace, there was no peace. And so the walls that were built to protect him became the very barriers that kept him from living. He ruled an empire, but could not walk among his people. He held the wealth of nations, but could not buy trust. He wore the crown of the sun, but could not feel warmth. The palace was not his kingdom, it was his cage. And every hallway echoed with the footsteps of a man who had everything except freedom. No matter how powerful a pharaoh became, no matter how many wars he won or temples he built, there was always one fear that lingered quietly in the shadows, the question of what came next. The line of succession was a fire that burned behind every throne, and it did not wait for age or illness to begin its whispering. From the moment the first child was born, the burden of legacy crept in, slow and relentless, like sand filling a tomb. An heir was more than a child. He was the continuation of divine order, the bridge between past and future, the living guarantee that the gods had not abandoned Egypt. But raising an heir was never simple. In many cases, there were multiple wives, each with children, each supported by powerful, noble families, and each hungry to see their own bloodline rise to power. And so, the palace that was already drowning in secrets and politics became a battlefield of silent ambition, with the pharaoh caught in the middle. The young princes were watched as closely as the king himself. Every cough was noticed, every stumble was noted. Tutors were sent to shape them into perfect shadows of the throne, teaching them the language of diplomacy, the logic of warfare, the intricacies of ritual. But no amount of training could prepare them for the weight they would inherit. And deep down, every pharaoh knew no one ever truly wanted the crown, not after seeing what it cost. Choosing an heir was dangerous. Declaring one child over the others risked revolt, jealousy, even civil war. Some pharaohs delayed the decision for years, hoping the answer would become clear. Others made early choices, only to be poisoned by those who felt overlooked. In some dynasties, half-brothers killed each other for the right to rule. In others, advisors manipulated the line of succession for their own gain. The throne was not just passed down, it was fought over, quietly, violently, endlessly. And even when an heir was named, fear did not end. The pharaoh began to see shadows in his son's eyes. Was that ambition or admiration? Was that curiosity or calculation? The boy who once sat on his lap became a young man with his own court, his own followers, his own desires. And the more the kingdom adored him, the more the pharaoh began to fear being replaced. For what is a god on earth if everyone is waiting for the next one to rise? Some pharaohs tried to control the transition, to ease their sons into power, guiding them gently, training them directly, hoping to shape them into something stable. Others kept their heirs at a distance, letting fear rule the relationship, using silence and commands instead of warmth. But no matter the method, the result was always the same: tension, distance, mistrust. There were cases where sons plotted against fathers, cases where fathers struck first, removing their own blood to protect the throne. The palace became a theater of suspicion. Even love was poisoned. A glance, a word, a gathering of officials, all could be signs of betrayal. The closer the heir came to adulthood, the more dangerous he became. And for the pharaoh, who had already lived through decades of pressure, it was a cruel final chapter to endure. But even beyond the heir, the pharaoh was haunted by the question of how he would be remembered. He knew his power was temporary, his body mortal, his name vulnerable. Would his son honor him or erase him? Would the temples chant his name or replace it? Would his statues remain standing or be shattered by the next dynasty? His legacy was not guaranteed. It had to be carved, preserved, protected. And so he built tombs deeper than before, temples taller, inscriptions longer, gold buried in secret chambers. He demanded hymns, murals, sculptures that showed his strength, his divinity, his perfection. He commissioned scribes to write his victories, even when the battles were bitter. He paid priests to promise eternal remembrance, all in the hope that when he was gone, the name he carried would survive. But deep down, he knew names fade. Sand covers even the greatest monuments. And no air, no matter how devoted, could preserve every piece. The world forgets. The gods move on. And the people eventually sing praises to someone else. So he sat in the final years, surrounded by treasures he could not take with him, by servants who feared him, by sons who might soon wear his crown. And though he still ruled, still gave orders, still walked through his palace with gold around his arms and incense in the air, he felt it slipping, the power, the fear, the illusion. He looked at his heir and saw the future staring back, colder than any tomb. For to be a pharaoh was to know that the world would one day belong to someone else, and that your only chance at eternity was to be remembered. But in a land where memory was carved in stone, even the strongest kings could be chipped away, cracked, and buried beneath another name. From the very first breath taken as a child born to the royal line, the idea of immortality wrapped itself around the pharaoh like a second skin. It was whispered by priests, taught by scholars, sung by the people in temple courtyards. You are divine, they said. You will live forever, they promised. But immortality was not a gift. It was a mission, a task, a haunting expectation that followed every step, every decision, every heartbeat. The pharaoh was not allowed to simply live. He had to prepare for eternity, and the road to eternity was paved with fear. Death did not wait for old age. It came in plagues, in infection, in treachery, in quiet coughs that worsened too quickly. So preparations began early. Tomb architects were summoned the moment a pharaoh took the throne. Plans were drawn. Mountains were hollowed. Chambers were measured by starlight and sacred math. These were not just burial sites. They were fortresses of memory, built to protect the soul from oblivion. And yet, the very act of building them was a reminder that death was never far. The tomb had to be perfect, every inch filled with meaning, spells painted on walls, statues placed at precise angles, gold buried beneath slabs of limestone, all so that the soul could pass through the trials of the afterlife unharmed. There could be no mistakes. One misplaced charm, one incorrect inscription, could doom the pharaoh to an eternity of hunger and darkness, trapped in the duat, the underworld, lost among serpents and fire. And it was not only the tomb, it was the body. The process of mummification was long, brutal, and sacred. The flesh was dried, organs removed, the heart carefully preserved or replaced, the face covered in linen and resin, not for beauty, not for tradition, but because the body was needed on the other side. Without it, the soul would be incomplete, a wandering echo in the desert wind. So, even in death, the pharaoh's body belonged to duty, to gods, to ritual. Offerings were not optional. Temples continued to present food, perfume, and prayers long after the body was sealed away. Generations of priests were paid to speak the pharaoh's name daily, to remind the gods of his deeds, to keep him alive in memory. But memory was fragile. One lazy priest, one change in dynasty, one political shift, and the offerings would stop. The name would fade, and the afterlife would grow cold. The greatest fear was not death, it was being forgotten. For the ancient Egyptians believed that to be unnamed was to be truly dead. No soul, no peace, no light, just silence. And so the pharaoh fought that silence with every tool he had. He ordered monuments that scraped the sky. He filled libraries with the records of his reign. He had scribes carve his name deeper than the floods could reach. He taxed villages to pay for statues, for temples, for festivals in his honor, because he knew that remembrance was not free. And yet, despite it all, he saw the truth. He saw the temples of his ancestors crumbling, Haya He saw statues worn smooth by sand and wind. He walked through halls where his great-grandfather's name had already been forgotten by half the court. He watched nobles praise the rising star of his own son, while barely mentioning his own victories. The myth of immortality cracked beneath the weight of time. There were tombs discovered by accident, looted by desperate hands, bones scattered by grave robbers who cared more for gold than legacy. There were pharaohs whose names were erased on purpose, struck from records, declared false kings condemned to vanish. Even gods changed, their temples taken over, their symbols reimagined. The world moved on. The promise of forever was as fragile as papyrus in a fire. So the pharaoh doubled his efforts. More offerings, more statues, commissioned hymns that declared his name as eternal, demanded carvings that showed him standing beside the gods themselves. He turned life into preparation, every year into insurance, every word into legacy. But it brought him no peace, only noise, only desperation. In the quiet of his final days, he sat surrounded by wealth, but felt no comfort. He looked at the workers still hammering limestone into sacred shapes, and wondered if they even knew why they were doing it, if they believed the same things he had been told his entire life, or if in their silence they saw the truth he could never admit out loud, that maybe all of it was just fear in disguise. And when the time came, when his breath slowed and the priests whispered their spells, he closed his eyes, not with joy, not with peace, but with one final question echoing through his soul. Will they remember me, or will I become just another name buried under the sand? For in the end, the myth of immortality was not about living forever. It was about hoping someone, somewhere, would still whisper your name long after the gold had faded and the gods had changed. To be a pharaoh was to embody perfection, not as a goal, but as an expectation carved into every breath, every word, every movement. From the moment the crown was placed upon his head, the pharaoh ceased to be seen as a man. He became an ideal, an image, a flawless embodiment of cosmic balance. He could not age, could not falter, not publicly, not even in the smallest way. Every imperfection was hidden, denied, silenced, and yet, inside that armor of divinity, lived a man just as fragile as any other. Perfection began with appearance. His skin was polished with oils daily, his nails shaped by attendants, his hair dyed black to hide any sign of time's passing. His face was carefully painted before public appearances, not for vanity, but for reassurance. The people needed to see their God King as ageless, tireless, eternal. If he limped, they whispered, 8. If he coughed, they prayed harder, 8. If he looked tired, they feared the gods were growing weak. So he stood tall, even when his legs ached, smiled, even when his stomach turned, and raised his hands in blessing, even when his heart was heavy with doubt. Perfection extended beyond the body into decisions. A pharaoh's judgment was expected to be wise, immediate, and without flaw. He was the ultimate judge, the highest authority, the one who could not afford hesitation. When disputes came before him, between nobles, between temples, between entire cities, he had to rule swiftly and flawlessly. One mistake could fracture alliances, stir rebellion, or offend the gods. And if his choice caused hardship, it was not blamed on chance. It was seen as failure to uphold Mat, the sacred order of the universe. The weight of Mat was crushing. Every sunrise was a test, every flood season a reflection of his soul. The Nile flowed too little. Had he failed in ritual? If war broke out on the borders, had he shown weakness? Disease struck? Had he lost favor with the divine? And when the people suffered, they did not blame fate. They looked to him. A god must be in control. A god must always be right. So the pharaoh carried their hunger, their fears, their hopes, not as sympathy, but as responsibility. In public, he was surrounded by praise, priest sang his name. Courtiers bowed so low their foreheads kissed the stone. Crowds reached out just to glimpse his face, but none of it felt real. The praise was expected. The chants were rehearsed. And deep inside, the Pharaoh knew that if a plague came, if the grain stores emptied, the same people who called him God would call him curse. Perfection was conditional. Worship was temporary. Loyalty was fragile. So he obsessed over control. He rehearsed speeches for days. He practiced rituals until they were muscle memory. He demanded absolute precision from his advisors, punished those who made him appear weak. Every record carved by scribes was reviewed and edited. Every statue sculpted was compared to sacred proportions. His image, whether painted, cast in gold, or described in scrolls, had to be flawless, not almost perfect, perfect. But no one can truly live without flaw. And so, the cracks formed in silence, the sleepless nights, the constant fear of making a wrong decision, the isolation from genuine conversation, because no one dared speak plainly to a god, the grief that could not be shown, the illness that had to be hidden, the aging that was inevitable, the doubts that crept in during quiet hours when the incense had burned down and the chamber was empty, and the stars outside looked as cold as the stone wall surrounding him. Some pharaohs broke under the weight. They turned to excess, surrounding themselves with pleasure and distraction. Others grew harsh, striking out at anyone who questioned them, punishing whispers as treason. A few simply disappeared, retreating from court life, letting priests and generals run the empire in their name. But no matter the path, the pressure remained. It never eased. It never forgave. And when the end drew near, when the body began to fail despite the oils and the prayers, the burden of perfection became heavier than ever. Because now every weakness was visible. Every misstep could not be hidden. The people saw. The court whispered. The priests hesitated. And the Pharaoh, once seen as divine, felt the crown slipping from his head. He thought of the gods, perfect, distant, eternal, and wondered why they had chosen mortals to bear their weight. He wondered if they ever truly spoke to him, or if the silence was always just silence. He thought of the people who needed him to be strong, even now, especially now. And so he stood, trembling, painted, draped in gold, and played the role one last time. For in the end, perfection was not something the Pharaoh achieved. It was something he performed until his final breath, until the very last prayer, until the tomb closed and the silence returned. To live surrounded by reverence may seem like a blessing, but to the Pharaoh it was a constant curse, one that turned every human connection into an illusion. Every relationship was shaped by fear, respect, or ambition, never sincerity. From the first moment he wore the crown, he stopped being a man. He became something else, something distant, something untouchable. The more the people revered him, the more invisible he became. Servants did not speak freely in his presence. They waited for permission to breathe. They knelt too long. They walked backward to avoid turning their backs. Even those who had known him before the crown, family members, childhood friends, nobles from his youth, they all changed. Their eyes avoided his. Their words became formal, rehearsed, heavy with titles and praise. It became difficult to tell who was being honest and who simply feared the consequences of truth. Friendship could not exist. How could it, when everyone feared disappointing a god? When a single mistake could mean exile, or worse? No one could sit beside the Pharaoh as an equal. No one could laugh in his presence without pausing first to measure whether laughter was appropriate. Terror, every emotion shown toward him was filtered through protocol. Every conversation was layered in expectation. Even love lost its meaning. Wives were chosen through alliances. They were daughters of nobles, priestesses of favored temples, symbols of peace with foreign rulers. They came smiling, but with agendas behind their eyes. Even if affection blossomed, it was tangled with obligation. And if love was ever real, it was suffocated by the palace walls, by the guards, by the endless rituals that separated man from woman, ruler from partner, heart from heart. Children respected the Pharaoh, but they did not know him. Raised in their own wings of the palace, taught by scholars and advisors, they learned to bow before they learned to speak. They memorized his titles before they understood his name. And as they grew older, they began to see him not as a father, but as a throne, something to inherit, something to fear, something to surpass. The warmth of family became a political arrangement, bound by blood, broken by ambition. The priests who claimed to serve him often served themselves first. Their chants were beautiful, their offerings grand, but beneath the incense and gold, they wielded power equal to the throne. They interpreted omens, declared the will of the gods, and could turn public favor with a single whisper. Their reverence was layered with manipulation. Pharaoh was holy, yes, but only so long as he followed the rules. Step outside the boundaries, and even the gods would be said to frown. The nobles, draped in finery, lined the palace halls with smiles carved from stone. They praised his wisdom, toasted his name, vowed eternal loyalty. But their loyalty shifted with the wind. They watched him for weakness. They flattered to gain favor. They gave gifts not from affection, but from strategy. The more they revered him, the less they respected him. For respect requires honesty, and in the palace, honesty was a dangerous thing. Even his own voice began to disappear, surrounded by constant praise. He started to hear only what others wanted him to hear. Advisors softened truths. Reports were altered to protect his mood. Mistakes were hidden. Bad news delayed. The illusion of control was maintained by layers of polite deception. He could no longer trust what reached his ears, because every word was wrapped in reverence. And yet, he longed for something real, a conversation without fear, a companion without agenda, a moment without performance. He watched the workers from afar, laughing, fighting, crying, without shame. He envied their freedom, their ability to be seen as who they truly were. He watched children run through markets, unburdened by destiny, and wondered what it felt like to live without expectation pressing down on your shoulders every moment of the day. He tried once or twice to remove the mask, speak as a man, to ask a question without title. But the moment he did, the air changed. People froze, eyes widened, and silence filled the room like water rising. The crown was invisible, yet ever present. It followed him into every corner. Even when he was alone, he felt it pressing into his skull. In the end, the reverence that had elevated him also isolated him. He was surrounded by people, yet untouched by companionship, surrounded by voices, yet unheard himself, loved by many, yet known by none. Reverence had become his shadow, constant, silent, and cold. When the time came for him to leave this world, he was placed in the finest sarcophagus. Priests wept. The court mourned. Songs were written in his honor. Statues were carved. His name echoed in stone halls and temple hymns. But none of those voices knew who he truly was. They praised the mask, not the man. They honored the idea, not the reality. And so, in death, as in life, the Pharaoh remained a symbol, remembered, feared, revered, but never truly known. Ask ChatGPT. To the outside world, the throne of Egypt appeared eternal, carved from gold, guarded by gods, passed down through divine bloodlines, untouched by time. But beneath the shimmer, beneath the legends, beneath the towering monuments that defied the horizon, the throne was made of sand, beautiful, shifting, unstable, and every pharaoh who sat upon it knew No matter how strong he seemed, the ground beneath him could shift at any moment. He sat at the center of the most powerful civilization on earth, but that power came at the cost of permanence. The laws he passed, the temples he built, the statues raised in his image could all be undone by the next ruler. History was not fixed. It was rewritten, reinterpreted, recarved in stone with new names, new stories, new gods. Legacy was not guaranteed. It was borrowed, fragile, temporary. The empire stretched far from the shores of the Mediterranean to the deserts beyond Nubia. Armies marched in his name. Trade routes opened because of his seal, and people in distant lands whispered the name of the Pharaoh with awe. But each victory required 1,000 sacrifices. Each triumph fed the cycle of expectation. More expansion, more taxes, more demands from the priesthood. The machine of empire never stopped, and it demanded more than one man could give. And as the years passed, the weight grew heavier. Injuries that once healed quickly now lingered. Days, once filled with ritual and command, became blurred by exhaustion. Memory, once sharp, began to fray at the edges. He could no longer recall the faces of servants from his youth, or the first lines of hymns once sung in his honor. Even dreams faded into stillness. And in that stillness came the truth he had always known, but never spoken, that no matter how many titles he carried, how many temples bore his likeness, how many festivals lit the sky in his name, he was not eternal. He was dust wrapped in silk, bone beneath gold, a flicker in the long stretch of time. And the throne he ruled from, no matter how high, sat atop a foundation that could not last forever. He looked at his works, the palaces, the walls, the statues carved with careful hands, and he knew others would come. Some would honor him, some would destroy what he built, some would take credit for his deeds, others would erase him entirely, claiming his victories as their own, painting his flaws larger than life. That was the way of power, to be used, remembered, forgotten, and replaced. He had ruled through droughts, through wars, through famine and celebration. He had buried friends, buried children, buried the man he used to be. And still, the people called him divine. Still, they waited for his words. But there was nothing more to say. The rituals had all been spoken, the crowns worn, the feasts held. What remained was silence. And so he prepared. His tomb was complete, spells inscribed, treasures sealed, the walls painted with the stories he wanted to last, his name etched deeper than any before, his body wrapped in linen, anointed with oil, adorned with jewels. The priests chanted, the court wept, the torches flickered, and the door closed behind him. In darkness, the Pharaoh waited, not for gods, not for judgment, but for memory, for someone, someday, to speak his name, to remember not the god, but the man, the one who smiled once, quietly behind closed doors, the one who wept for a lost child, the one who stared at the stars and wondered if they ever stared back, the one who wore the weight of a kingdom and never once laid it down. Years passed, dynasties changed, the sands rose, the temples cracked. His name faded from the tongues of priests, from the pages of scribes, from the minds of his people. Statues fell, tombs were looted, gods were forgotten. The throne shifted again, rebuilt by others who believed they too would last forever. But now, you are here, listening, wondering, feeling the echo of a man who ruled so long ago. And in this quiet moment, you carry his story forward, not as a tale of glory, but as a truth of burden. A reminder that even the greatest among us are fragile, that even gods can be lonely, that even pharaohs, golden, divine, untouchable, sat on a throne made of sand. And so, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift like the Nile beneath moonlight. Okay. And remember, not the king, not the god, but the man behind the crown. Forgotten by time, remembered in sleep. Rest now, as he did, as all do, eventually. In the end, the life of a pharaoh was not one of untamed luxury or effortless power, but a long, quiet endurance, a performance that never paused, a burden that never lifted. The world saw gold, saw temples, saw an empire shaped by will. But beneath it all was a single human being, born into expectation, molded by ritual, consumed by duty. The gods may have placed a crown on his head, but they also placed chains around his soul. He was called divine, yet he lived with fear. He was praised by thousands, yet knew not a single honest voice. He ruled the kingdom, yet could not walk freely within it. Every joy was filtered through protocol. Every decision weighed by unseen consequences. Even in death, he was not granted peace, but transformed into legend, hollowed out by centuries, remembered more as a statue than as a man. This is the truth buried beneath the gold, beneath the stone, beneath the silence of forgotten tombs. To be a pharaoh was not to live above the people. It was to be trapped beneath their expectations. Worshipped, yes, but never embraced. Adored, but never known. Feared, but rarely understood. Now, as you rest, as your breathing slows, you carry his memory, not the memory found in textbooks or carved into crumbling temple walls, but the quiet memory of the person beneath the headdress, the one who once looked out from his palace, longing not for more riches, but for freedom, the one who bore the weight of gods, not with pride, but with quiet resignation. And maybe, just maybe, this small act of listening is what he needed all along. Not temples, not statues, but someone, anyone, to hear the truth behind the silence. So let go of the weight of the world. Let the burdens fade with the stars above the desert. And as you drift into sleep, remember that even the greatest were once human too. Even the mightiest longed for peace. And sometimes the most powerful souls are those who never had the chance to rest until now.